So what we're talking about really is something that we could call the unexpected discovery of an incomprehensible reality or an incomprehensible world, which is obviously enough a fairly significant kind of a thing. And we could say that if we look into subatomic physics and pursue that line of inquiry, what happens is we run slap bang into the unexpected discovery of an utterly incomprehensible world. That's fairly straightforward. I was going to say that's pretty much incontrovertible, but then the unexpected discovery of an incomprehensible world, I suppose it is kind of maybe not controversial, but it's kind of not something that everyone would be happy to agree with. But if you were a physicist, you would. So who cares what everyone else might say? Because they don't really care anyway. They're not really interested in finding out what reality really is. Or maybe I shouldn't say that. Some people are, but on the whole, most people aren't. It's fair enough to say. And if you're a physicist, you're in the wrong job if you're not interested in working out what reality is and what it isn't. You're a totally wrong job. You should get some other job, maybe. So that's all straightforward in a way. So the point I was making, not in the last episode, but the one before that, is that the discipline of psychology does not end up in us unexpectedly discovering an incomprehensible reality. It doesn't, and then that's fair enough. Lots of things don't end up with us discovering, etc., etc. So, of course, they don't. Life would be very confusing if all lines of inquiry very quickly led to the discovery of an unexpected and incomprehensible reality. That would make things very be hard to get on with things. So, for the most part, it's fair to say we don't have anything to do with any such thing as an incomprehensible reality. Instead, we have a comprehensible reality, eminently comprehensible reality. So the point I was intending to come to was, how does all of this talk impact practically on therapy? So never mind all the waffle. How does it actually impact on the actual practice of what we call psychological therapy? And how can we say that there is a rabbit hole in psychological therapy? Because that's what I was kind of getting to in the not the last episode, but the one before that. And that's a very easy thing to talk about as it happens. It's something that we can explain very quickly, and it's not hard to express. So what happens is that the basic way in which we operate gets turned on its head when we pass from the conventional world, which could be called the consensus reality, or it could be called the world of everyday living, or it could be called anything. So when we pass from that into the psychological realm, the inner realm, then the basis upon which we understand things and organize ourselves and navigate through life and orientate ourselves gets turned on its head in a very, very dramatic way. And if we don't appreciate this, then we get into trouble because we keep on trying to apply the old laws, the old rules, the old ways, and do what we do in everyday reality as if the inner world is the same thing as everyday reality, which is an assumption that is quite understandable we could make. But it's a lazy assumption. All assumptions are lazy, I guess, because the world is a stranger place than we like to give it credit for. And a key part of this strangeness, or a big part of this strangeness, is the fact that the inner world is so very, very different from what we would think it is. So why is it different? What the hell am I talking about? Why can't I just get to the point? And why it's different is because there's a kind of a fundamental principle that we use in everyday life. And we could say that's the principle of causality. I do X, and then Y happens in a predictable way. So there's great psychological security in that, because I know every time I do X, Y happens. It's great to know that. It's like, yeah. And that's control, of course. What we're talking about here is control. So we can say it's control because I know that if I do X, Y is going to happen. Therefore, I'm controlling what happens. It's control. Control is where we get our sense of psychological security from. Sometimes we take it too far and become control freaks, or coercive people who like to coerce everyone else, tyrants. That's taking it too far because it doesn't make anyone happy. Certainly doesn't make the other people who I'm trying to control happy. And in the end, it obviously can't make me happy either, because no one gets happy being a control freak or an obsessive kind of controlling person. That's not a satisfying road to go down, because you have to control more and more, and you can never control enough, and you just keep getting cross, basically, and frustrated, and you have to control some more, and you end up in a bad place. Maybe you end up in prison even, I don't know, for controlling people too much. Either that, or you end up being, I don't know, in a position of authority where you can get away with it, possibly. You can become a dictator of a country, then you get away with it, or become the head of a MI5 or the CIA or something. That could be a legitimate way which you could get away with it, maybe. But control doesn't work. The point that I'm trying to get to is that control doesn't work in the inner world. There's no causality in the inner world. Now, we could object and say there has to be causality. Causality is everywhere. There is always causality. There is never not causality. And of course we could object like that, but the reason we do is because we're freaked out, because that's our rug being pulled from under us. That's our psychological security vanishing in a puff of smoke. So that's not a good reason for making statements about reality. We'd be better off saying, oh, I'm very alarmed or threatened by this talk of there being no such thing as causality, or the possibility of control in the inner world. That really worries me and scares me. I can say that. That's very legitimate and honest. But you just mouth off and say, oh, there is no such thing as some kind of realm where there is no control and no causality. That is just fear speaking. Fear speaks a lot. It's got many voices, but it always says the same thing. It shuts everything down. It tries to make the universe not be as surprising and interesting as it is, and make reality be dull and unsurprising. That's what fear always wants to do, because fear likes that. Fear likes to have an unchallenging world, a very, very predictable, unremarkable world. But no such world exists. So no matter how much we strive for it or seek after it, that's another road that just leads to frustration and demoralization. We won't get anywhere, no matter how hard we try, if we're trying to make something be the case that isn't the case. But how can we say that in the inner world there is no such thing, there's no control? Because it's very obviously true that in all of our therapies, or most of our therapies, it all hangs together because of control, because there is a protocol. And if there is a protocol, that means I do this and X and Y will happen, i.e. something favourable. That's what happens when we take part in any type of rational therapy. We're given a guideline, we're given guidelines, we're given steps to follow. And the implication inevitably, obviously, is if you follow the steps, then a good result will happen. You become less anxious, you become more relaxed, you become less angry, you become less depressed. Do X and Y will happen. That covers all rational therapy. And that would be great if it weren't for the fact that we've forgotten something very important. That if it's psychological therapy we're talking about, then straight away we're talking about the inner world, not the outer everyday world or the consensus reality world, not the game that we play in everyday life, in other words. So there's a big problem, because straight away you've made the biggest, dumbest mistake we could possibly make. We've failed to recognize the peculiar nature of the inner world. Maybe we've never really looked at it. Maybe we don't want to look at it. And we think the inner world is a continuation of the external everyday reality. And actually, the external world isn't any different from the internal world if we look into it closely enough, as quantum physics shows. It's all the same, the inner and the outer. But there is this other world, which is kind of a pragmatic everyday reality which does obey rules, in which there are no paradoxes. But in the inner world, as soon as we try to behave purposefully, there is massive paradox, which means that but when there's a massive paradox, that means that our controlling gets banjaxed, because controlling really needs for there to be no paradox. If I do something and it gives me the result that I wanted, that's non-paradoxical. If I do something and get the opposite result, that's paradoxical. And that's the reason the whole realm of mental health and mental suffering is so tricky, because we don't understand paradoxicality, and we don't understand what paradoxicality is telling us. It's telling us something very important, but we're so shocked by the loss of the possibility of control, which is what paradoxicality is, that we can't really see it clearly. We're just too busy being freaked out. And when we get freaked out, we just try to do the purposeful behavior, whatever it is. We try to do it more emphatically, more forcefully. We put more energy into it because we think, well, this isn't working, I have to try harder. But that's no good, of course, because when we try harder, the paradoxicality increases. So the harder we try, the bigger the paradox and the more it hits us in the face. So that's not good. That's a learning situation right there. And it's a learning situation that's kind of very brutal, really, because it involves an awful lot of pain. And because we are so slow at learning this particular lesson, we persist. We persist very, very, very stubbornly. And we get stuck in the pain as a result. Ultimately, we might learn through enough pain, which will teach us in the end, I guess. Well, it will teach us in the end, but ideally we would like to be able to learn a bit quicker, if at all possible. So the thing that we can't do in the inner world is that thing called purposeful behavior or purposeful activity. We just can't do that. If we understood that, we'd be fine, because we wouldn't keep trying to do it. Purposeful behavior is inextricably linked with having a concept of the world, or a model of the world, or a picture of the world. Because all purposeful behavior rides on the back of our theories or models of the world. It has to. I can't be purposeful without a definite picture of the world. And actually, my purposeful behaviour is the same thing as my map of the world. It's an extension of it. It's the same thing. And in the inner world, there are no proper ways to look at things. There are no models, no theories, no maps. Because this isn't that type of a world. It's not a rational world. It's not a world of our concepts. It's a world where there are no descriptions and where we cannot comprehend what's going on. We can't make a picture of it in our mind. If we do make a picture of it in our mind, that just means making a concept of it, making a mental construct of it. But a picture, a mental construct, a concept is not the inner world. That's the system of thought. That's the consensus reality. That's the what we would call in the everyday world. So as soon as we start making pictures, we're trying to oversimplify reality into making it something that we can completely understand and feel at home in and get psychological security out of, and that's fine. But it isn't the inner world. We're always trying to escape from the inner world, which Jung somewhere calls the watery world. It's like being deep underwater and we don't know what's up and what's down. A fish might come up and swim up to us and look at us, and we don't know whether I don't know whether I'm me or the fish, because the inner world isn't a polar world. It's not me and you. There are none of these boundaries. The boundaries which create the possibility of living in a known world don't exist. That's why there isn't any knowing, any rational understanding. That's why there is no polarity of what is me and what isn't me. There just isn't, because the boundary between me, what's me and what isn't me, is a thing that thought does. It doesn't exist. It provisionally exists in the everyday world because we agree that it shall exist. We want very much for it to exist. We insist on it existing, but it doesn't exist in the inner world, which is how things are when we're not making it be a particular oversimplified way that suits us. So we're not projecting our own form of order on the inner world. And the inner world contains everything, and it has no boundaries, no compartments, no map to show us what's what and who's where. And it's no map even to show us that there is such a thing as where, because without a map there is no where. There's no location. So straight away we can see how immensely challenging the inner world is, because we can't have a location. So earlier I was saying that we can't orientate ourselves in the same way that we do in the everyday reality, because the everyday reality is all about maps, it's all about frameworks, grid works, it's all about location. Location, 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 as they say. It's all about location. Now in the real outer world, there's no location either, because that's what physics shows. And in the inner world, there's absolutely no location. And yet how can I orientate myself without knowing that without there being a here, so that I can say I'm here, or there, so I can say that's over there? No here, no there. No polarity, no framework. So that's very challenging. It's not intrinsically challenging, because it's not an awkward situation, because that's just the situation of reality being reality, of nature being nature, of the Tao being the Tao. So that's not problematic in itself. but we're not used to it because we are used to living in the artificial reality that we ourselves have made up for convenience. So it's kind of, we're used to our comfort zone. We're used to the games that we play. And so when we're not playing a game and we're not in our comfort zone, that is very, very challenging because we're not used to it. It freaks us out big time. And yet we can't turn our back on it. We can't, in the long run, turn our back on the inner world. And the reason we can't turn our back on the inner world is because the inner world is all there is. There's the outer world as well, but the outer world is the inner world. Inner space equals. That just sounds a bit hippie, maybe, but it is the realm of the very, very small. If we get smaller than Planck's constant, is also the realm of the very, very big. That's physics. It's not any airy-fairy philosophy or anything like that. That's just physics. So we can't turn our back on the inner world because the inner world is the only world there is, and what's more, it is us, because that's our nature is also like that. So the inner world is a non-polar world, and our nature essentially is non-polar. So if we do turn our back on our own nature and reality as it is in itself, which we do, our whole life is just one big exercise in turning our back on the inner world and the nature of how things really are. It's one big, big endeavor to do that. It's the great escape. That's what we do. That's where our identity is founded upon this escape. The whole polarity of winner versus loser is founded upon this escape, because someone who can successfully escape from reality is called a winner. But of course there are no winners because nobody can do that. So the thing about turning our back on the inner world, which is also the outer world when it comes down to it, is that it is going to spell very big trouble for us sooner or later. And the only cure for this trouble is to stop turning our back on the inner world. Okay, thanks for watching.